Chosen one, you are not here by chance. Before another ordinary moment slips quietly past you, pause here, not because you are being interrupted, but because some moments carry a weight that can only be understood when the heart becomes still enough to notice them. What you are about to hear is not rushing toward you with noise. It is arriving gently, like the first light before sunrise, asking for nothing except your attention for a little while longer. Don't skip, because something meaningful is waiting to unfold, and every piece of it matters. There is someone whose thoughts have circled back to you more times than they can count. Not because they were forced to. Not because anyone reminded them. But because certain connections have a quiet way of returning, even after long stretches of silence. Some feelings refuse to disappear simply because time has passed. Instead, they grow quieter, deeper, until one unexpected moment brings everything back to the surface. Today is one of those moments. Something shifted. Not with fireworks. Not with dramatic scenes. Just one small decision, one unexpected conversation, one realization that quietly changed the direction of someone's heart. From the outside, almost nobody would have noticed it. Yet for the person who has been carrying unspoken emotions, it felt as though an invisible door had finally opened. Have you ever wondered why certain memories appear without warning? Why a familiar name suddenly comes to mind while doing something completely unrelated? Why a feeling arrives before any explanation can catch up to it? Sometimes life moves in quiet patterns long before we recognize them. Stay with this story until the end, because what seems like coincidence at first slowly begins to reveal another layer. Every detail matters. Every pause has a purpose. And every unanswered question is preparing the next part of the journey. The one this story speaks about has spent more time reflecting than anyone around them realizes. They replayed conversations that seemed ordinary. They remembered words they once ignored. They began noticing the spaces between moments instead of only the moments themselves. And somewhere within those quiet reflections, one truth became impossible to avoid. They still needed to speak. Not to rewrite the past. Not to erase every mistake. But because silence had become heavier than honesty. That realization did not arrive overnight. It came after countless ordinary days that slowly revealed extraordinary meaning. Sometimes growth doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it simply appears one morning, looking back at the person in the mirror, asking a question they can no longer avoid. What happens if I stay silent forever? That single thought changed everything. Imagine standing at the edge of a conversation you've postponed for far too long. Every excuse suddenly feels smaller than the truth waiting on the other side. Every reason for hesitation begins losing its strength. Every heartbeat quietly reminds you that some words become more valuable the longer they remain unsaid. That is where this story begins. Not at the ending. Not at the reunion. But at the exact moment someone finally understood that waiting another day would change nothing. The remarkable part isn't that they thought about reaching out. The remarkable part is what happened immediately before that decision. An unexpected encounter, a simple sentence, and a quiet reminder from everyday life combined in a way they never anticipated. None of those moments seemed important on their own. Yet together they formed a picture that was impossible to ignore. Isn't it fascinating how life sometimes speaks through ordinary experiences instead of extraordinary events? The smallest moments often carry the greatest turning points. As the day continued, they found themselves noticing details they had overlooked for months. Familiar places suddenly carried unfamiliar meaning. Old memories no longer felt distant. Even the quiet moments between conversations seemed filled with questions waiting for answers. The more they reflected, the clearer one realization became. Some people leave an imprint that time cannot easily erase. Not because life stands still, but because certain connections quietly shape who we become. That realization brought peace instead of confusion. It replaced hesitation with clarity. And clarity led to one simple intention. I need to talk. Those words remained unspoken, yet they echoed through every decision that followed. Something important had happened, not something dramatic that everyone could see, but something deeply personal that changed the direction of their thoughts. It was the kind of change that begins inside long before it becomes visible outside. If you've ever sensed that life sometimes prepares conversations before they actually happen, you already understand the feeling growing inside this story. There is still one piece missing. One conversation has not yet begun. One truth has not yet been spoken aloud. And one quiet moment is approaching faster than either person expects. When it finally arrives, nothing will look extraordinary from the outside. Yet everything inside will be different. And that is where the next chapter quietly begins. The quietest moments often carry the greatest turning points, and this was one of them. Nothing around them appeared unusual. The world continued moving at its familiar pace. Conversations came and went. Cars passed by. Clocks continued their patient rhythm. Yet beneath that ordinary surface, a decision had already begun taking shape. There is something remarkable about the instant when uncertainty starts giving way to clarity. It doesn't arrive with loud announcements. It settles gently, almost unnoticed, until one simple realization changes the meaning of everything that came before. The person this story speaks about had reached that moment. For a long time, they believed waiting would somehow make the right words easier to find. They imagined tomorrow would offer better timing, better confidence, better circumstances. But tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow, and silence quietly stretched longer than either of them ever expected. Then something happened. It wasn't extraordinary to anyone else. It was simply a conversation they happened to overhear. Someone nearby spoke about missed opportunities, about how people often wait until the perfect moment appears, only to discover that the perfect moment had been quietly standing beside them all along. Those words lingered. They couldn't explain why. Perhaps because deep inside, they already knew they had been waiting for permission that was never going to come. Sometimes the heart doesn't need another sign. Sometimes it simply needs enough honesty to stop running from itself. Stay with this journey a little longer, because another layer is about to unfold. The meaning isn't found in one dramatic event. It's hidden inside small choices that slowly gather enough courage to become something unforgettable. As evening settled in, familiar memories returned, not as painful reminders, but as gentle teachers. They remembered laughter they had almost forgotten. Quiet conversations that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt priceless. Even the smallest details carried warmth they hadn't appreciated at the time. That was when another realization quietly appeared. People often remember the final conversation they had with someone. But they rarely remember the conversation they never had. That thought stayed with them. It followed them through every quiet moment. It became impossible to ignore. What if the words waiting inside deserved to be spoken, not because they would change the past, but because they reflected who they had become today? Growth has a fascinating way of revealing itself. It doesn't ask us to become different overnight. It simply invites us to become more honest than we were yesterday. Little by little, hesitation began losing its grip. The questions that once created confusion started creating direction instead. What if reaching out isn't about fixing everything? What if it's simply about opening the door? The answers didn't arrive immediately. But peace did. And sometimes peace arrives before certainty. That is enough to begin. Far away, completely unaware of these quiet reflections, another heart was moving through an ordinary day with its own unanswered thoughts. There were moments when an unexpected memory appeared without invitation. A familiar smile crossed their mind for reasons they couldn't explain. Certain songs seemed to carry old conversations between the notes. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps life simply has a gentle way of reminding people about connections that still deserve understanding. No one could see what was happening beneath the surface. No grand gestures. No dramatic scenes. Only two separate journeys slowly moving toward a conversation that neither one could have imagined only a short while ago. The remarkable thing wasn't that everything suddenly became clear. It was that both of them had quietly stopped pretending the questions no longer mattered. That alone changed the direction of the story. One reached for courage. The other became unexpectedly open to listening. Neither knew the other had changed. Neither knew that the distance between silence and conversation had already begun shrinking. Some stories don't move forward because fate forces them. They move forward because ordinary people choose honesty over hesitation. And somewhere, at the edge of another ordinary day, a message remained unwritten for only a few moments longer. Not because the words were missing, but because the final breath before courage often lasts longer than anyone expects. When that silence finally breaks, the first sentence will reveal far more than either heart is prepared to hear. No one could have predicted that the next step would begin in complete silence. There was no dramatic announcement, no sudden interruption, only a single quiet moment in which hesitation finally became lighter than hope. Sometimes the greatest changes begin long before anyone else can see them. They begin inside a heart that has grown tired of wondering what might have happened if only one honest conversation had taken place. The message was still unwritten, yet it already existed in countless unfinished thoughts. Every sentence had been imagined, rewritten, erased, and imagined again. Not because the words were difficult, but because they mattered. When something is deeply meaningful, people often search for the perfect way to express it, forgetting that sincerity is usually more powerful than perfection. As the evening continued, familiar places carried unfamiliar meaning. A path walked hundreds of times suddenly reminded them of a shared memory. A quiet melody drifting through the air brought back a smile they thought had faded long ago. Even the gentle rhythm of the day seemed to whisper that some chapters deserve another page before they are allowed to close. Stay with this story a little longer. Something important is still unfolding, and its meaning becomes clearer with every passing moment. Across the distance, another quiet realization was taking shape. Without knowing why, the other person felt an unusual sense of calm. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't certainty. It was simply the feeling that something unfinished was slowly finding its way back into the light. Have you ever noticed how life occasionally becomes unusually still just before an unexpected conversation arrives? It is as though ordinary moments make room for something that has been patiently waiting to appear. Neither of them knew what the other was thinking. Neither could see the invisible journey unfolding at the same time. Yet both had quietly arrived at the same conclusion. Some conversations are worth having, even if they begin with nothing more than a simple greeting. That thought became impossible to ignore. The fear of saying the wrong thing slowly gave way to a different question. What if kindness is enough? What if honesty is enough? What if the first words don't need to solve everything, they only need to open the door? That realization changed everything. For the first time in a long while, they stopped rehearsing every possible outcome. Instead, they allowed themselves to believe that understanding grows one sentence at a time, not all at once. The phone rested nearby. The message remained unsent. But now it carried something it had never carried before. Confidence. Not the confidence of knowing exactly what would happen, but the quiet confidence that comes from choosing authenticity over endless hesitation. Sometimes that is the bravest step anyone can take. As the night grew quieter, one final memory returned, not to create regret, but to offer perspective. It reminded them that every meaningful connection is built through small acts of courage. One conversation. One moment of listening. One choice to remain open instead of closing the heart. That memory became the final piece they had been missing. A gentle smile appeared. The deep breath they had been holding for so long finally softened. Their hand moved closer. The screen lit up. The cursor blinked patiently, waiting for the first word. And just before that first sentence appeared, something unexpected crossed their mind, something so simple, yet so meaningful, that it changed not only what they were about to say, but why they wanted to say it. That quiet realization is where the next part of this journey begins. A single blinking cursor has a curious way of slowing time. It waits without judgment, asking only one question: what is true enough to be written? For a few long moments, nothing appeared on the screen. Then, instead of searching for impressive words, they chose the simplest ones they could find. After all, the conversations that stay with us forever rarely begin with perfect speeches. They begin with honesty. The first sentence was short. It carried no grand promises. It offered no dramatic explanation. Yet it held something far more valuable: a willingness to be genuine. The instant those words appeared, an unexpected calm settled over them. The weight they had been carrying for so long no longer felt quite as heavy. It was as if deciding to reach out had already begun changing them before the message had even been sent. Don't look away just yet, because another quiet piece of the story is about to reveal itself. At that very moment, the other person found themselves pausing in the middle of an ordinary evening. They couldn't explain why. Nothing unusual had happened. The room was as familiar as ever. The sounds around them hadn't changed. Yet something gently invited them to stop rushing and simply breathe. Life has a remarkable way of creating stillness before meaningful moments. Not because the future is fixed, but because the heart sometimes recognizes importance before the mind understands it. They glanced toward their phone almost absent-mindedly. No notification. No message. Just silence. And yet they smiled without knowing the reason. Perhaps you've experienced something similar. A quiet sense that a chapter isn't over, even when you believed it had reached its ending. Not certainty, just possibility. Sometimes possibility is enough to keep hope alive. Meanwhile, the message continued to grow one sentence at a time. Each word reflected someone who had changed through patience rather than pressure. Gone were the rehearsed explanations and imagined arguments. In their place was a simple desire to be understood honestly, without expecting immediate answers. That change mattered. Because real conversations begin to heal not when every question has been answered, but when both people become willing to listen. As the final sentence was written, another pause arrived. Not from fear. From reflection. They read every line again, asking themselves one quiet question. Does this sound like the person I want to be today? For the first time in a very long while, the answer came easily. Yes. No more pretending. No more hiding behind perfect timing. No more waiting for circumstances that might never exist. Only sincerity. Only kindness. Only one small step forward. Their thumb rested above the send button. So close. Close enough that one gentle movement would carry every unspoken thought into the hands of another person. Yet before that happened, something unexpected caught their attention. A memory surfaced, not the happiest one, nor the saddest, but the one that reminded them why this conversation mattered in the first place. It wasn't about changing the past. It wasn't about proving who was right or wrong. It was about honoring a connection that had quietly shaped both of their lives. That realization transformed the message once again. One final sentence was added. It was the shortest sentence of all. Yet somehow it carried the greatest meaning. They looked at it for several silent seconds. A peaceful breath followed. Outside, the evening continued as though nothing remarkable was taking place. Inside, everything had changed. The distance between silence and conversation had become smaller than ever before. Only one gentle decision remained. And the moment that decision is made, the story will begin moving in a direction neither of them expected. Morning arrived without announcing itself, carrying the quiet kind of light that makes everything feel possible again. The world looked exactly as it had the day before, yet something inside this story had shifted. Sometimes the biggest moments don't change the scenery around us, they change the way we see it. Their hand remained still for just a heartbeat longer. Not because doubt had returned. Because they finally understood the value of what they were about to do. Every word had been chosen with care. Every sentence reflected the person they had become rather than the person they used to be. There was no desire to impress. No need to explain every detail. Only a quiet hope that honesty would be enough. Stay with this journey a little longer. The next few moments reveal why everything that happened before was necessary. Then, with one gentle tap, the message was sent. There was no dramatic music. No instant reply. No extraordinary sign. Only a tiny confirmation that the words had left their hands and begun a journey of their own. For a few seconds, they simply stared at the screen. A surprising feeling settled over them. Relief. Not because they knew what would happen next, but because they had finally stopped carrying everything alone. Across the distance, another ordinary day continued. The other person was busy with familiar routines, unaware that something meaningful had quietly entered their world. They smiled politely at people around them, finished small tasks, and moved through the morning exactly as they always did. Then, a soft notification appeared. Nothing more than a brief sound. Easy for anyone else to ignore. But something about it encouraged them to pause. Without rushing, they reached for their phone. For a moment, they didn't unlock it. Instead, they took a slow breath, almost as if part of them already sensed that this wasn't just another message. Have you ever experienced that feeling? When life gently asks you to stop for a second before revealing something you've been waiting for without even realizing it? The screen lit up. The sender's name appeared. Time didn't stop. But attention did. Their eyes remained fixed on those familiar words. A quiet smile appeared before they had even opened the message. Not because they knew what it said. Because they never truly expected to see that name appear again. One simple notification awakened countless memories, not painful ones, but meaningful ones. Conversations that once felt unfinished. Laughter that had quietly remained somewhere in the heart. Dreams that had never completely disappeared. They opened the message slowly. Every sentence invited them to keep reading. There were no dramatic promises. No impossible expectations. Only sincerity. And sincerity has a way of reaching places that perfect words never can. As they reached the final line, they didn't respond immediately. Instead, they placed the phone down beside them. Not out of hesitation. Out of respect for what they had just read. Some messages deserve silence before they deserve an answer. They looked out the window for a long moment, reflecting on how much can change when one person finds the courage to speak honestly. Then something unexpected happened. A thought crossed their mind that had never appeared before. It wasn't about the past. It wasn't about mistakes. It was about the future. For the very first time, they began wondering what could be built instead of what had been lost. That single realization quietly opened a brand new chapter. Their fingers slowly reached for the phone once more. This time, they weren't reading. They were preparing to write. The first word of their reply hovered in their thoughts. And the sentence they were about to send would take this story somewhere neither of them had imagined.